The Arizona sun was merciless that afternoon, hammering down on the parking lot of the Phoenix Veterans Affairs Center, until the air itself seemed to ripple. Jack Hensley paused before stepping out of his old Ford truck, staring through the windshield as if the heat waves could blur the thoughts that wouldn't stop tormenting him. Inside, the smell of dust and metal mixed with the faint hum of the radio, static and country music caught in between stations. He turned it off, took a deep breath and whispered, "Just one more session, Jack. One more." Jack was 37, a decorated soldier whose eyes no longer shone with pride. They carried the dull ache of memories that refused to rest. Since coming home from Iraq, his nights had been carved by flashes of noise and fire, the sound of boots over gravel, and names he could never say out loud. Therapy was supposed to help him let go. Instead, each visit to the VA center felt like walking deeper into a maze that had no exit. Dr. Laura Bennett had been waiting for him. Her office was always the same: neutral colors, the faint scent of lavender, a small photo of her family on the desk. She smiled as he entered, calm and professional, yet her eyes revealed a trace of worry. "You've been quieter these past weeks," she said, closing her notebook. Jack shrugged, sitting down heavily. "Quiet's better than loud, isn't it?" "You tell me," she replied gently. Outside, the desert heat pulsed against the windows. Jack looked toward the blinds as if searching for something beyond them. "Sometimes," he said, voice low, "I hear the engines again. Not dreams. Awake. I can't tell what's real anymore." Dr. Bennett leaned forward. "You're safe here, Jack. That's what this space is for." He stared at her hands folded neatly on her lap. "I keep thinking about that night in Fallujah. What I did, what I didn't do." The clock ticked louder. The silence stretched until she finally said, "You're here to face it, not to let it define you." Jack nodded, but his jaw tightened. "If I face it, what happens then?" "Then you start to live again," she said. He smiled faintly, sad, almost broken. "We'll see." That was the last confirmed conversation anyone had with Jack Hensley. At 4:27 p.m., he left Dr. Bennett's office carrying only his keys and wallet. Security footage showed him stepping into the corridor. Then, somewhere between the elevator and the exit, he vanished. No one saw him leave the building. No car ever pulled out of the lot. By nightfall, his wife Marianne was calling every hospital in Phoenix. By dawn, a missing person report was filed. Police searched the desert outskirts, the canals, even the mountains north of the city. Nothing. A veteran had disappeared without a trace. Before we uncover what really happened to Jack Hensley, make sure to subscribe for more true stories that reveal the hidden truths behind America's most haunting cases. The answers to this one would take decades to surface, and when they finally did, Phoenix would never see itself the same way again. The phone on the Hensleys' kitchen wall rang until it became part of the night's rhythm. Marianne stood beside it, clutching the receiver with trembling fingers, her other hand pressing against her chest as if to steady her heart. The desert wind brushed against the window, carrying faint echoes of passing traffic from the I-10. Every sound outside felt like a possibility: a car door, footsteps, maybe even Jack's voice returning to her. But each time she answered, it was never him. When Detective Raymond Cruz first came to their home 2 days later, his shirt clung to his back in the late August heat. "Mrs. Hensley," he said carefully, his tone measured, "we're doing everything we can." He placed a small notepad on the table, but Marianne could see the fatigue in his eyes. He'd been through too many missing persons cases to promise miracles. "My husband wouldn't just walk away," she said, her voice cracking. "He had therapy that afternoon. He was getting better." Cruz nodded, jotting notes. The VA reported he left the session at around 4:30. Security says he exited the office area, but no one saw him after that. Marianne frowned. "You mean he disappeared inside the building?" "That's what makes it complicated," Cruz admitted. "No signs of struggle, no broken cameras. It's like he just—" He stopped himself. "We'll keep looking." For weeks, the search spread across the city. Flyers with Jack's face, smiling in his uniform, hung on light poles, bus stops, and church boards. Friends and veterans from his old unit helped search the outskirts of Phoenix, combing through arid fields and canal trails lined with mesquite and tumbleweed. The smell of hot earth filled the air, mingling with sweat and despair. Each day, Marianne returned home with her shoes coated in dust, her hope thinning but never breaking. She called the VA repeatedly, demanding updates. "We're cooperating fully with the police," they told her, always the same rehearsed tone. The newspapers ran a brief column about the missing veteran case, but the story disappeared within days, replaced by headlines about rising temperatures and city development. At night the house felt hollow. Jack's boots remained by the door. His toothbrush was still beside hers. Their son Ethan, only 10, kept asking, "Mom, when's Dad coming back from his appointment?" She could never find the words to answer. Sometimes she would sit at the kitchen table, the phone resting silent beside her, staring at the clock as if sheer will could rewind it. The silence was heavier than grief. It was uncertainty turned into air, filling every room she walked through. A month later, Cruz returned. "Mrs. Hensley, I need to be honest," he said, removing his hat. "We've exhausted most leads. There's no indication of foul play." She looked up sharply. "You're saying he just vanished?" "People don't vanish, Detective." He hesitated. "Sometimes they do." Her gaze hardened. "Is not my husband." Outside, the desert sun began to set, casting the Phoenix sky in shades of rust and gold. Marianne stood at the window, whispering his name like a prayer, as if the wind might carry it to wherever he was. Dr. Laura Bennett sat alone in her office as the late afternoon light faded into the slats of the blinds, turning everything a muted gold. The building was quieter than usual. Most of the staff had gone home early, weary of the reporters waiting outside. They'd been coming every day now, shouting questions through the glass doors. "Did you see him last? Was he unstable? Are you being investigated?" She rubbed her temples, the weight of it pressing down like the desert heat that never quite left the walls. Her assistant, a young intern named Michael, hesitated at the door. "They're still out there, Dr. Bennett," he said softly. "Do you want me to tell them you've gone home?" She shook her head. "No. I'll leave after dark." He nodded, uncertain, then closed the door behind him. The room fell back into stillness except for the low buzz of the ceiling light. Laura looked down at her desk, the thin manila folder labeled Hensley. Jackie sat open before her. Inside were notes from every session they'd shared. Her handwriting trembled slightly on the last page. "Patient exhibits signs of dissociation, increasing guilt. Potential flashbacks triggered by unresolved trauma." She whispered the words to herself, as if saying them could make them mean something different. When the first police interview took place, she'd told Detective Cruz everything she remembered. "He was improving," she'd said, her tone calm but distant. "We talked about managing guilt, not reliving it. I encouraged him to focus on grounding techniques." Cruz had studied her quietly. "Did he seem upset that day?" Laura hesitated. "He was reflective, tired maybe, but nothing alarming." "Did he say anything that suggested he might harm himself?" "No," she said firmly, her jaw tightening. Jack wasn't suicidal. He was fighting to stay. Still, she could feel his doubt. She'd seen it in the way he looked around the room, taking in every detail. The diploma on the wall, the books neatly aligned, the empty chair across from hers. She knew how it looked. She was the last person to see him alive. When the story hit the local news, everything changed. Neighbors stopped waving. Colleagues avoided eye contact in the hallway. One headline read, "Veteran vanishes after therapy. Questions surround VA counselor." Another quoted an anonymous source suggesting ethical concerns. Laura's reputation, built over 15 years of careful work, began to unravel. Her phone rang constantly. Reporters, families of other patients, even strangers demanding answers. "What did you do to him?" one voice asked before hanging up. At night she lay awake replaying their final session, every word, every pause. Quiet's better than loud, isn't it? Jack's voice echoed in her memory. What had he meant? Had she missed something hidden beneath the surface? Her reflection in the darkened window looked older, worn by guilt and suspicion. The city lights outside shimmered in the distance like heat mirages. She whispered into the empty room, "Where did you go, Jack?" The silence that followed felt almost alive, stretching between what she knew and what she feared might one day be revealed. By the spring of 2004, the city of Phoenix had moved on. The heat returned early that year, curling the edges of old missing person posters that still clung to a few sun-bleached telephone poles. Jack Hensley's face, once familiar to every local newscast, now looked faded. Just another unresolved mystery in a city that had too many. Detective Raymond Cruz sat at his cluttered desk, flipping through the case file for what felt like the 100th time. The paper had begun to yellow at the corners, the ink smudged by sweat and time. He traced a finger over Jack's photo. Uniform crisp, smile modest, eyes steady. There was no reason a man like that should just vanish, but after months of dead ends, even Cruz had to admit the trail was gone. He leaned back in his chair, watching the dust drift lazily through the light from his office window. "We chased every lead," he muttered. "And it all comes back to nothing." His partner, Officer Linda Keene, looked up from her computer. "The wife still calls?" "Every week," Cruz said quietly. "Still thinks we're missing something." "She's not wrong," Linda replied. "But sometimes that's just the truth. People disappear, the desert eats them." Cruz sighed, closing the file with a soft thud. Not this one. He wasn't the kind who'd run. Across town, Marianne Hensley had begun volunteering with a local missing persons network. The group met in a church basement once a week, parents, siblings, and spouses clutching photos of the vanished. Folding tables were covered with maps, pins, and coffee cups gone cold. She listened to others speak, sometimes nodding, sometimes crying quietly, always holding Jack's dog tags in her hand. One evening, a woman named Grace leaned over and said, "It never really stops hurting, but helping others, it's how you stay standing." Marianne nodded. "I just want someone to know he mattered." She began organizing searches of her own, revisiting the canals, the stretches of open desert near South Mountain, anywhere Jack could have gone. Each time she returned home empty-handed, the silence grew heavier. Ethan, now 11, had stopped asking when his father would come back. He just left his baseball glove on the porch, untouched. At the VA center, Dr. Bennett continued her sessions with other veterans, though whispers followed her through the hallways. The staff had learned to lower their voices when she passed. She kept her head down, finishing paperwork long after dark, her once steady hands occasionally trembling as she signed her name. By late 2006, the Phoenix Police Department officially archived the case. The word "closed" was stamped across the front of the folder. It wasn't closure. It was surrender. Cruz didn't even attend the final meeting. He'd already boxed up his files and stored them in the evidence room's back corner, where they would gather dust with the others. On the night he filed the last report, Cruz stood outside the station, lighting a cigarette he didn't want. The desert wind swept through the parking lot, carrying sand and heat across his face. He exhaled slowly, staring toward the horizon where the city lights blurred into the darkness. "Where the hell did you go, Hensley?" he murmured. No one answered, only the wind. 2 decades later, the desert still held its secrets. The year was 2023, and the air over Phoenix shimmered the same way it had back in 2003, hot, relentless, and full of things left unsaid. Eli Torres parked his dusty Jeep outside the small newsroom of the Arizona Sentinel, where the faint hum of old air conditioners competed with the clatter of keyboards. The walls were lined with yellowing newspaper clippings, most of them forgotten stories, except one. A missing veteran, 2003. Jack Hensley. Eli had seen that headline before, years ago, when he was fresh out of the army himself. He remembered the photo of Jack in uniform standing proud, the caption reading, "Local hero seeks help for PTSD, then vanishes." Something about that story had stayed with him all these years, like a thorn buried too deep to remove. Now, as a reporter trying to make sense of veterans' care in Arizona, the name resurfaced. He typed it into the archive database. The system whirred, sluggish but loyal, pulling up a folder of scanned articles, faded and grainy. There were only a handful, 2 short columns, a missing person notice, and a brief update months later that led nowhere. He frowned. That's it? A man disappears from a government facility and no one follows up? His editor, a middle-aged woman named Claire, looked up from her desk. It was a cold case, Eli. No body, no suspects, no funding. Happens all the time. Still, he said, scrolling through the records, something about it doesn't sit right. The VA barely released a statement. Claire sighed, setting down her coffee. You think there's a story there after 20 years? I think there's a silence, he said. And silence usually hides something. Later that evening, Eli drove through downtown Phoenix, the same streets Jack must have walked years earlier. The city had grown since then. New condos, coffee shops, and lights spilling into the desert. But under the surface, the same dry pulse of secrets remained. He stopped outside the Phoenix VA Center. The building looked different now, renovated, sterile, quiet. But the air around it carried a certain unease. Through the glass doors, he could see a receptionist typing behind a plastic barrier. When he introduced himself and mentioned the name Jack Hensley, her hands froze over the keyboard. That case? She said softly. So you're digging that up again? Trying to understand what really happened, Eli replied. She hesitated, then said, You're not the first to ask, but the files, most of them are sealed or gone. You'll have to go through public records. That night, back in his small apartment near Tempe, Eli opened his notebook. On the first page he wrote, What happened to Jack Hensley? Then beneath it, Who wanted it forgotten? He stared at those words for a long moment before closing the notebook. The desert outside was silent, its vastness both beautiful and merciless. He didn't know it yet, but reopening that file would pull him into something far deeper than a simple mystery. It would test his own understanding of loyalty, truth, and how far people will go to bury the past. The drive north to Glendale was long, lined with sunburnt fields and the faint outline of mountains that shimmered like ghosts in the afternoon haze. Eli Torres gripped the steering wheel, the radio low, his thoughts louder than the static. 20 years had passed since Jack Hensley vanished, yet something about the case felt unfinished, as if a voice had been waiting all this time to be heard. He parked in front of a modest beige house on a quiet cul-de-sac. A wind chime swayed lazily by the porch. Marianne Hensley opened the door before he could knock, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her eyes cautious but curious. "You're the reporter," she said softly. "Yes, ma'am. Eli Torres. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." She nodded and stepped aside. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old photographs. The walls were covered with family pictures. Jack in uniform, Jack at the Grand Canyon, Jack holding a baby boy who must have been Ethan. Every image seemed to carry the same warmth, frozen in time. "I don't usually talk to journalists anymore," she said, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs. They came when he disappeared, and then they forgot. Everyone did. Eli sat quietly, his recorder untouched on the table. "I'm not here to sensationalize anything, Mrs. Hensley. I'm trying to understand what went wrong." She looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. It wasn't just the war that took him, it was what came after, the waiting, the pills, the silence. He trusted that VA therapist. Dr. Bennett said she helped him talk again. Then one day he didn't come home. Eli nodded slowly, writing in his notebook. "Did the police ever share what they found?" "Nothing worth sharing," she said, bitterness slipping into her voice. "They said he walked out of the building, but I saw the reports. There were missing minutes in the security footage." "They never explained that." Eli's eyes lifted. "You saw the reports yourself?" She smiled faintly. A mother learns to read between lines when the truth won't come. Outside, a dry wind rustled the trees, scattering brittle leaves across the porch. Marianne's voice softened. "I still dream about him, you know, same dream every time. He's standing in the desert, sun in his eyes, like he's trying to remember the way home." Eli hesitated before asking, "Do you still believe he's alive?" She looked down at her hands, pale against the coffee mug. Belief changes over time. At first, I believed he'd walk through that door. Then I believed someone out there knew the truth. Now, she paused. Now I just believe he deserves to be found. Eli closed his notebook carefully. I'll do everything I can, Mrs. Hensley. As he stepped back into the sunlight, Marianne called after him. If you want to know who Jack really was, look past the records. Look at who he trusted and who he shouldn't have. Her words lingered in his mind as he drove away, the desert stretching endlessly ahead, holding its secrets beneath the burning Arizona sky. The sun was already high when Eli Torres pulled into the cracked asphalt lot of the old Phoenix VA Center. The building stood like a relic from another era, its beige walls bleached by 2 decades of relentless sun, its glass doors reflecting a sky too bright to look at. The facility had been renovated since Jack's disappearance, but the air around it still carried something stale, like memory refusing to fade. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights filled the long corridor. Eli introduced himself to the receptionist, showing his press badge. I'm looking into a 2003 case, he said. Jack Hensley. He disappeared after a therapy session here. Her polite smile faltered. That's before my time, she said, tapping nervously on the counter. You might want to speak with maintenance. Some of the old staff still come by. She pointed him toward the back hallway. The floor creaked as he walked, the air conditioning barely cutting through the desert heat. The farther he went, the quieter it grew, until he heard the faint sound of a mop bucket rolling. Excuse me, Eli called. A gray-haired man in a faded VA uniform turned. His name tag read R. Vasquez. Yeah? I'm a reporter, Eli said, extending his hand. Trying to learn what happened to a patient, Jack Hensley. You were working here in 2003, right? Vasquez hesitated. Depends who's asking why. His family still wants answers, Eli said quietly. The old man studied him, then nodded toward an empty bench near the vending machines. I remember that day, he said slowly. Real hot one, the kind of heat that burns your lungs. Hensley came in early, I think, saw the doc upstairs, then poof, gone. Eli leaned forward. You saw him? Not after the session, no, but I saw the doc, Dr. Bennett. She came out of her office looking shaken, like she'd seen a ghost. Later that night, some folks were talking about missing footage. Eli frowned. Footage? Cameras on the second floor, Vasquez said, lowering his voice. Whole hour missing. They blamed a power surge, but I was here. Lights never flickered. Eli's pulse quickened. Was it ever reported? Vasquez gave a weary smile. You think anyone wanted that trouble? The VA keeps things quiet. They don't like loose threads. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence. Then Vasquez added, You didn't hear this from me. But check the storage room in the basement. Records, tapes, old boxes. Some things get forgotten down there. Eli thanked him and started toward the elevator, his notebook already open. As the doors slid shut, he felt the weight of the building pressing in, years of untold stories trapped in its walls. Outside, the desert wind picked up, sweeping dust across the lot. He glanced back at the VA center, the reflection of the sun slicing across the glass like a warning. Somewhere inside that place, he thought, was the truth Jack Hensley never got to tell, and someone had worked very hard to keep it buried. The road to Prescott wound through miles of dry earth and sun-bleached brush, each turn revealing a stretch of desert that looked the same as the last. Eli drove with the windows half open, the wind biting and dry, carrying the faint scent of creosote after a brief morning drizzle. In the distance, the mountains rose like shadows against the pale blue sky. He had spent weeks tracing Dr. Laura Bennett, now living quietly under her maiden name, Laura Maddox. He found her in a small adobe house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by silence. When she opened the door, she seemed older than her years, her eyes weary, her hands still delicate but marked by time. I knew someone would come eventually, she said, her voice calm but brittle. It was only a matter of when. Eli nodded. I'm looking into Jack Hensley's disappearance. I was told you were the last person to see him alive. She gestured toward a chair. That's what the reports say. Inside, the house was lined with books, psychology, trauma studies, and a few family photos turned face down. The air smelled faintly of chamomile tea and dust. Laura sat across from him, clasping her hands tightly. "I've thought about that day for 20 years," she began. "Every word, every pause, every silence between us." "What do you remember most?" Eli asked. She exhaled slowly. He was restless. Haunted, yes, but there was more. He'd started remembering things he'd buried after Iraq. Guilt, anger. He said someone had made him sign papers he didn't understand. I tried to guide him toward confronting that memory safely, but he grew agitated. Said he needed to make it right. Eli wrote quickly, his pen scratching against the paper. Did he say who he meant? Her eyes flickered toward the window. No names, just that he'd been used, that the war wasn't what he thought it was. Silence filled the room, heavy and taut. "After the session?" Eli asked. Laura's hands trembled slightly. He walked out. I followed a few minutes later. The hallway was empty. I thought he needed air. When I heard he never came home, I couldn't believe it. Eli studied her carefully. The missing camera footage. Were you aware? A faint crack formed in her composure. "Yes," she whispered. "I asked about it. They told me the files were corrupted. But I saw the logs. There was no power failure that day." Her voice faltered, guilt threading through every syllable. "You have to understand. I was told to stay quiet, that going public would damage the integrity of the department. They called it a procedural error, but I knew better." Eli leaned forward. "Who told you that?" She hesitated, her gaze sharp for the first time. "You wouldn't believe me if I said, and even if you did, they wouldn't let you print it." The clock on her mantel ticked louder. She reached for her tea, her fingers trembling. "Jack wasn't just a patient. He was trying to tell me something important, and I didn't listen soon enough." Eli closed his notebook gently. "Then help me listen now." Laura's eyes met his, filled with both relief and fear. "You don't know what you're asking, Mr. Torres," she said softly. "The truth doesn't just destroy reputations, it destroys people." The next morning, Eli sat in his apartment surrounded by papers, audio notes, and fragments of a story that refused to fit neatly together. The ceiling fan spun lazily above him, stirring the desert heat that crept in through the blinds. Laura Bennett's confession had opened a new door, but behind it was only more silence. He replayed her voice on his recorder. "Jack wasn't just a patient. He was trying to tell me something important." He scrolled through the Department of Defense database, cross-referencing Jack's military record. The files were heavily redacted, whole paragraphs blacked out. But something caught his eye. Operation Sandglass, Fallujah 2003, a restricted mission. The listed participants included several soldiers from Jack's unit. 3 names were crossed out, marked KIA. But one remained, Staff Sergeant Alan Dre. Eli leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "Dre," he murmured. "Why does that name sound familiar?" He searched again, this time through old local news archives. There it was, a 2005 article about a veteran-turned-private contractor involved in VA security upgrades in Phoenix. Alan Dre. The same year the case went cold. A chill crawled up Eli's spine. He picked up his phone and called Detective Cruz, now long retired. The line crackled before a gravelly voice answered. Cruz speaking. "Detective, this is Eli Torres, journalist. I'm looking into the Jack Hensley case." A pause, then a weary sigh. "Haven't heard that name in years. Thought it had finally died out." "It hasn't," Eli said firmly. "Did you ever come across the name Alan Dre?" Silence stretched on the line. "Yeah," Cruz said at last. "He worked security for the VA back then. Quiet guy. Too quiet. Why?" "His name's all over Jack's unit records. And he had access to the building cameras the day the footage went missing." Cruz cursed under his breath. "I'll tell you something off record. We questioned him once. He had an alibi, and the higher-ups shut the inquiry down fast. Said we were wasting resources. That's when they told me to close the file." Eli's pen stilled above his notepad. You think there was pressure from the VA? I think, Cruz said slowly, somebody wanted that man forgotten. Eli hung up and stared at the city through his window. The Phoenix skyline shimmered in the heat, the horizon blurred and endless. Somewhere beneath all that light was a darkness no one had dared to touch. He began requesting documents through Freedom of Information Act channels, unit logs, medical transfers, internal VA communications. Most came back denied. A few arrived partially censored, but one memo slipped through. Subject: audio recorded sessions. Patient Hensley, JE Archive 03VA77. His breath caught. Therapy tapes. There were recordings of Jack's sessions. He called the Phoenix VA Records Office immediately. Those tapes, he said, where are they kept? The clerk hesitated. All 2003 files were transferred to federal storage in Tucson years ago, but that batch never arrived. Eli's grip tightened on the phone. You're saying they disappeared? That's what it says here, the clerk replied. Eli leaned back, his pulse quickening. 20 years of silence, missing footage, vanished tapes. Jack hadn't just disappeared, someone had erased him. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly before Eli, a sea of ochre dust and brittle shrubs glinting under the noon sun. The tip he'd received the night before had been vague, an old construction worker claiming he'd found something years ago near the Camelback Mountain foothills. Didn't seem like much, the man had said over the phone, but there was fabric, military maybe. It was the first tangible lead in 2 decades, and Eli wasn't about to ignore it. He parked his Jeep on the edge of a dry wash, the air rippling with heat. The worker, a weathered man in his 60s named Carl, stood beside a pickup, boots half buried in the sand. His tanned face was cracked like desert clay, eyes hidden behind scratched sunglasses. "You're the reporter?" Carl asked. "That's me," Eli replied, wiping sweat from his neck. "You said you found something." Carl nodded toward the slope. "Over there, near that mesquite. It was back in '05 when they were grading the land for that housing project. I saw a piece of fabric, looked like part of a uniform. Thought maybe a hiker lost it, but the pattern, camo, old type, didn't feel right." Eli followed him across the sand. The heat rose from the ground in shimmering waves, carrying the scent of sage and dry rock. When they reached the spot, Carl knelt down, brushing at the soil with a gloved hand. "Ground here's soft," he said. "Stuff don't stay buried long." After a few minutes, Eli saw it. A small patch of faded green fabric tangled around a rusted metal tag. His stomach tightened. The tag was half buried, scorched around the edges, the letters barely legible. He crouched closer, whispering as he read, "Hensley, the J.E." His throat went dry. "It's him." Carl's expression hardened. "You think someone put him here?" "I think someone didn't want him found," Eli said quietly. He placed the tag carefully into a plastic evidence bag and photographed the coordinates on his phone. Then, brushing aside more sand, he found something else, charred fragments of fabric and a single button, melted but still shaped. The heat pressed down on him like a weight. He could almost hear Jack's voice from Laura's notes. "Sometimes I hear the engines again, not dreams, awake." By late afternoon, the evidence was secured. Eli called the Phoenix Police Department. "This is Eli Torres," he said. "I believe I've located remains connected to a missing veteran, Jack Hensley. You'll want to send a team." Detective Raymond Cruz's name came up again, retired but still listed as the case contact. When Cruz answered, his voice was calm but sharp. "Where exactly are you?" Eli gave him the coordinates. Silence. Then Cruz said, "Stay put, don't touch anything else." The call ended and Eli stood alone, the wind rising around him. The desert hummed with cicadas and silence, the kind that seemed older than time. He stared at the ground where the tag had been. The truth was no longer buried. It had begun to surface, grain by grain, under the relentless Arizona sun. Something told him this was only the beginning of what the desert still had to say. 2 weeks after the discovery near Camelback Mountain, Phoenix buzzed with rumors. The police hadn't released details, but word spread quickly through veteran circles. Jack Hensley's dog tags had been found. The announcement came quietly, buried between news about city budgets and a heat advisory, yet it rippled through the community like an aftershock. Eli Torres sat in his newsroom, the hum of air conditioning struggling against the desert heat, when his phone rang. "Torres," he answered. "Detective Cruz," the voice replied. It had the same gravelly calm as before, but this time there was tension underneath. "You might want to come down to headquarters. We've made an arrest." Eli grabbed his notepad and keys. "Who?" There was a pause, then Cruz said, "Alan Dre." The name hit like a blow. "The security contractor? You're sure?" "Come see for yourself," Cruz said before hanging up. When Eli arrived, the station buzzed with quiet urgency. Reporters lingered outside, cameras poised, though no official statement had been given. Inside, Cruz stood near a glass-walled interrogation room, his arms folded. Through the glass, Eli could see a man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, shaved head, eyes dark and flat. Alan Dre. "He didn't talk much at first," Cruz said, "but when we showed him what we found in the desert, he cracked." Eli studied the man. "What did he say?" Cruz sighed. "He admitted to getting rid of evidence. Files, recordings, anything linked to Hensley. Said he was following orders. Claims it wasn't supposed to go that far." Eli's pulse quickened. "Orders from who?" "Didn't say. Or wouldn't." Inside the room, Dre sat motionless, his cuffed hands resting on the table. A detective leaned forward, asking something Eli couldn't hear. Dre's lips moved slowly, deliberately. Cruz tapped the glass. "He said Jack confronted him that day, about something he wasn't supposed to know. A report from their unit, classified, said Hensley accused him of covering it up. Things got heated." Eli's pen hovered over his notepad. "And then?" "Dre says he pushed him. Claims Jack hit his head, panicked, called someone higher up and they told him to keep quiet. Next thing he knew, the footage disappeared and the case went cold. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavy." "You believe him?" Eli asked. Cruz's gaze hardened. "Doesn't matter. We've got enough to charge him with evidence tampering and obstruction. Maybe more, depending on what forensics pulls from the site." As Dre was led out in handcuffs, reporters shouted questions that went unanswered. His face remained expressionless, but for a brief second, his eyes flicked toward Eli, cold, unreadable, as if daring him to keep digging. Outside the station, the heat pressed down like a weight. Eli stood on the sidewalk, phone buzzing with notifications. The story was breaking fast. Arrest made in 2003. Veteran disappearance. Headlines, photos, reactions, all of it spreading through Phoenix. But beneath the noise, something didn't fit. Dre's confession sounded rehearsed, incomplete. Someone had orchestrated this, Eli thought, and whoever they weren't finished yet. The truth had surfaced, but it was only a fragment. News of Alan Dre's arrest hit Phoenix like a flash flood, sudden, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. By morning, the headlines blared from every corner of the city. Veteran's disappearance solved. Security contractor arrested in cold case. The same faces that had disappeared from the media over the years were back, and they were hungry for answers. Eli stood in front of a small crowd gathered at the VA center, the cameras and microphones trained on him. He hadn't planned on being the one to deliver this news, but his role had somehow shifted from investigator to spokesperson. His phone buzzed in his pocket, messages from Marianne, from Dr. Bennett, and others he hadn't spoken to in years. He didn't respond. The doors of the VA center were crowded with reporters, but the inside was eerily quiet. Veterans and staff moved through the halls, avoiding eye contact. No one seemed to know what to say, as if the weight of the past 2 decades had finally caught up with them all at once. Dr. Laura Bennett appeared in the lobby, her expression unreadable. Eli caught sight of her as she walked toward the back offices, her steps deliberate. It was clear she was being pulled in every direction, her phone glued to her ear. But there was something in the way she held herself, defensive almost. He approached her, keeping his voice low. "Dr. Bennett, now that Dre's in custody, what can you tell us about what happened that day?" She stiffened. "I don't have any more answers than what's already been reported, Eli." I did my best to help Jack, Eli pressed. You knew Jack was struggling. Why didn't you push harder to get the truth out? Her eyes flashed with anger, but she controlled it quickly. You think I didn't try? You think I wanted this to happen? She took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. I'm not a criminal, Eli. I didn't know what Dre was involved in. I didn't know who to trust. Eli hesitated before responding, seeing the pain beneath her frustration. You could have done more. We both know that. The words hung in the air, but before she could reply, a voice interrupted. Dr. Bennett, I need a statement. It was a reporter shoving a microphone into her face. She gave him a tight smile and stepped away, the scene unfolding in front of Eli like a rehearsal for something they'd all been too afraid to admit. Eli turned to look at the rest of the staff gathered in the hallway. They watched, their faces guarded, their loyalty to Jack and to the institution split in half. Some of them wore the unmistakable look of guilt, others just confusion. Everyone, it seemed, had been waiting for someone to take responsibility. In the corner of the room, Marianne Hensley entered, her eyes scanning the crowd. She didn't speak immediately, but when she did, her voice carried the weight of 2 decades of grief. I'm not here for apologies, she said, her words cutting through the tension. I'm here because my husband deserves to be remembered, and the truth needs to come out. No more hiding. The reporters, who had been focused on Dr. Bennett, now turned their attention to Marianne. She stood tall, the quiet strength that had carried her through years of waiting finally on display for everyone to see. Eli watched her, a mixture of admiration and sadness in his chest. He had been right. This story was more than just the facts. It was about redemption, justice, and the cost of silence. But more than that, it was about the people who had lived through it, the ones who had been left behind in the shadows. And now, the light was finally beginning to break through. The press conference was scheduled for 11 a.m. at the Phoenix Police Department, and the air outside the station simmered with tension. Eli stood at the back of the crowded room, his camera barely capturing the flurry of reporters and microphones as they scrambled for the latest word. Alan Dre's arrest had shaken the city, but it was the new revelations that had the room on edge. Something bigger had been uncovered. Detective Cruz walked up to the podium, his face grave as he adjusted the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We have new developments in the case of Jack Hensley, the missing veteran from 2003. Following the arrest of Alan Dre, further investigation has revealed that Dre was not acting alone. A second individual was involved in the cover-up of Hensley's disappearance. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Cruz. Eli's heart pounded in his chest as he listened. A second person? That was news to him, and it seemed to be news to everyone else. The second person, Cruz continued, is a former high-ranking VA official, now retired. We are in the process of securing their cooperation and gathering further evidence. But this investigation has confirmed that there was an intentional effort to suppress evidence, mislead authorities, and prevent Jack Hensley's family from finding the truth. The implications were staggering. Eli scribbled down notes, his mind racing. The arrest of Dre was just the beginning. There was someone higher up, someone with the power to erase records, manipulate footage, and bury the truth. Marianne Hensley, standing in the back, held a tight grip on her purse, her eyes fixed on Cruz as he spoke. Eli could see the mix of hope and fear on her face, the years of unanswered questions finally beginning to make sense. But he also saw the weariness. This was a victory, but it had come at a tremendous cost. When the press conference ended, Eli made his way toward Cruz, pushing through the crowd. Detective? A second person? Can you give us any details? Cruz looked at him, his face lined with exhaustion. I can't confirm much yet, but we're looking into someone who had the means to manipulate VA records and cover up the footage. They're trying to bury everything, Eli, but we're getting closer. Eli nodded, but something lingered in his mind. The names, the tapes, the cover-ups, they all led back to one thing. Jack Hensley had known something, and he had been silenced for it. That evening, Eli sat at his desk, reviewing the case files once more. There were pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit, the missing hours in the security footage, the names erased from the military logs, the sudden changes in protocol after Jack's disappearance. Dre had been the key, but the person above him was the one who had truly orchestrated the silence. Eli's phone buzzed. It was Marianne. "I just spoke to Detective Cruz," she said, her voice tight. "He said we might have answers soon, but I'm not sure I'm ready for the rest of this story." Eli exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the journey ahead. "I understand, but the truth is out there, Marianne. And it's going to take all of us to make sure Jack's voice is finally heard." Outside, the Phoenix skyline glowed under the fading sunlight, but it was no longer just a city skyline. It was a monument to all the forgotten truths, waiting to be uncovered. Jack Hensley's story was no longer buried in the desert sand. It was being brought to light piece by piece, and nothing would stop it now. Phoenix, the city that had watched Jack Hensley disappear, was now forced to confront the truth that had been buried for years. The arrest of Alan Dre and the confirmation of a second person's involvement had set off a wave of reactions: anger, grief, and a desire for accountability that rippled across the veteran community. But for Marianne Hensley, it was a bittersweet victory. She sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd waited for Jack's return every day for 2 decades. The house was quieter now, the air filled with the scent of coffee and the sound of old news reports playing softly in the background. Eli's name had become familiar in their household as his investigation had brought back memories, both painful and healing. Marianne picked up the framed photograph of Jack from the table, his young face smiling back at her. It had been taken before the war, before the years of darkness and silence. For a moment, she let herself remember the man he had been, not just the shadow he'd become in her mind, the man who had once been full of life, full of hope. The phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Eli. "Marianne, I just spoke with Detective Cruz," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. "They've got enough now to charge the second person. It's over. Jack's story is finally being heard." She closed her eyes, allowing the words to settle. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up." "I couldn't," Eli replied quietly. "You never did. That's why I couldn't either." For a long time, Marianne had wondered if the truth would ever come, if the silence would break. The years of uncertainty had shaped her, twisted her, but they hadn't broken her. And now, the weight she'd carried for so long, the burden of not knowing, was lifting. She looked out the window, the late afternoon light casting long shadows over the neighborhood. Phoenix was still the same, and yet it wasn't. The city had witnessed the unraveling of a story that was far larger than just one missing veteran. It had exposed the cracks in a system meant to protect those who had served. But in the midst of the storm, something had begun to heal. The community that had forgotten Jack Hensley was starting to remember him, not as a casualty of war, but as a man who deserved to live and die with dignity. His story was no longer a cold case, his name no longer a statistic. Marianne's heart swelled with a mixture of sorrow and relief. She would never stop mourning Jack, but now she could begin to breathe again. She could begin to heal. As the evening crept in and the city settled into the cool desert night, Marianne held the photograph close. She whispered softly, "You're home now, Jack. You're finally home." The healing had begun. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough. The city of Phoenix had changed in the weeks since Jack Hensley's case was reopened. There was a new energy in the air, a feeling of unfinished business finally being addressed. For the first time in years, the streets seemed to hum with the kind of purpose that had been missing, perhaps because people knew the truth about what happened to a man who had given everything and had disappeared without a trace. Eli Torres sat in his office, the window open to the Arizona heat. His fingers tapped absently on the desk as he watched the sunlight shift through the blinds. He had written the story. He had broken the case wide open, but the real work was just beginning. Jack Hensley's name had become a symbol, not just for the veterans he had served with, but for all the ones who had suffered in silence. And now that silence was being shattered piece by piece as new stories emerged, of neglect, betrayal, and the haunting cost of a government system that had failed those it was supposed to protect. But for Eli, it was more than just another story. It was about redemption and about finding the parts of a person's life that mattered most. As he sat there, he thought about the journey, the long road that had led to this point. It had started with a phone call, a cold case, and a name he couldn't shake, and now it was ending with something more profound, a legacy that would endure long after the headlines had faded. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. Eli, it was Marianne. Her voice was steady, but there was a quiet strength in it now that hadn't been there before. I wanted to thank you. I know it's been a long road, but I've never felt like this before. Eli could hear her smile on the other end of the line. I'm glad we could bring Jack home, Marianne. You were the one who never stopped fighting. All I did was help you tell his story. There was a long pause. No, Eli, she said softly. You helped us all, you gave us the truth, and sometimes that's all you need to heal. Eli felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of her words heavy with meaning. He had been part of something bigger than a case, than a headline. He had been part of a community that needed healing, just as much as Marianne and Jack had. That evening, the city fell into twilight, the sun dipping behind the mountains, casting the desert in a golden glow. Eli stepped outside and looked toward the horizon. Phoenix, like so many others, was filled with people who had carried their stories in silence for too long. Jack Hensley's story, like so many others, had been buried by the very system that was supposed to protect him. But now it was out in the open. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real, and for Eli that was enough. The wind stirred the desert sands as he stood there, thinking about what he had learned. The truth, no matter how painful or hidden, always finds its way to the surface. The question was never if it would come out, but how it would change those who found it. As the last light faded from the sky, Eli walked back to his apartment. Behind him, Phoenix buzzed with the energy of a new beginning, an energy that would live on in the legacy of a man who had fought, quietly, for what was right. Jack Hensley's story was no longer a cold case. It was a reminder of the cost of silence and the power of speaking out.